Hey everybody, welcome back to part two of today's lecture series. In this section, I'm going to be talking a little bit about today's reading, Andrew Wallace-Haddrill's The Social Structure of the Roman House. So Andrew Wallace-Haddrill is a professor at the University of Cambridge. He is a historian and an archaeologist, which means that he is sort of interested in both the material cultural remains of the ancient world and also the literary representation of the ancient world by ancient writers. So this article that you read kind of reflects that balance, this desire to meld our sources together from multiple areas to form a better understanding of how social life worked in the ancient world, and how to sort of root that search for a better understanding in domestic space, which is an area for which we have a lot of information. Now, some of the difficulties of Andrew Wallace-Haddrill's work, or some of the critiques that have been leveled at it, are based in the fact that our literary sources from ancient Rome tend to skew from a pretty specific point of view, which is wealthy, elite males, often those who are politically connected in some way. So two of the sources that show up a lot in Andrew Wallace-Haddrill's article fit that bill a lot. The first is Cicero. Marcus Tullius Cicero, the senator, orator, rhetorician, author, firebrand, lawyer, intellectual. He was super prominent in the late Republic, but he was aligned with the sort of forces of the old way. And this has something to do with the fact that he was a novus homo, a new man, the first in his family to join the Senate, and a bit of an assimilator, somebody who tried to work within the system in order to sort of gain power and merit his spot in the upper echelons of the system. So Cicero, we can sort of read his biases because he's such a well-documented historical figure in this way. He was eventually murdered in the late Republic on the orders of the Second Triumvirate, so before Emperor Augustus consolidated power. The other person who sort of forms the basis for a lot of Wallace-Haddrill's work here is the writer and architect Vitruvius. And Vitruvius is most famous for his treatise on architecture, De Architectura, which he actually dedicated to the Emperor Augustus. So he's writing a little bit later than Cicero, but they are overlapping time-wise. And Vitruvius, of course, if he's dedicating his work to the Emperor Augustus, that probably means that he's operating within this sort of Augustan framework of propriety, abundance, an emphasis on traditional values, things that we've seen advanced when we were looking at the Areopagus a couple weeks back. So both of these authors are operating very comfortably within the sort of ruling class of society at the time. And that's worth bearing in mind when you think about the way that they might talk about how you organize space, right? Because they would be the people who would have the most vested interest in maintaining the status quo as advanced by the politically enfranchised at the time. But they're still valuable for showing us this emic view, right? This view from within society on society. So if we take the literary perspectives and our archaeological remains and we think about them together and how we can use them to inform one another, we can get a better idea of how people lived in the ancient world, as I've said. So what Wallace-Haddrill begins with is thinking a little bit about how space is organized. And he comes up with these two axes, and we have the public to private axis and the grand to humble axis. So if we take a look at one of these Roman houses then and try and map this onto them, let's come back to a house that we've seen before here, the House of the Faun in Pompeii, that we visited last week. And here's a reconstruction drawing of the interior that kind of fleshes out what the interior would have looked like at the time, or perhaps may have looked like at the time, rather. you can see that the entrance to the house itself is quite narrow, with the shops opening onto the frontage of the street. But then when you get into the atrium area, which is what is pictured in our reconstruction here, you have this large open space with really impressive high ceilings, wall paintings to decorate the walls, mosaics and opus sectile that cut stonework on the floors. We have our impluvium here, that pool that collects rainwater from the open roof, with its famous statuette of the faun. Decoration sort of on every level, sort of saturating the room and making it a very impressive place to be. If you think about how Roman households were organized and what they were used for, which isn't something we've talked a whole lot about yet, um, this part of the Roman house was a public space. It would be open to people to walk in off the streets and visit, especially at certain times of day. And we will be discussing who those people are momentarily. But if you walk into the atrium, it's this very grand space that is also public. Thinking a little bit about how the house might move into more private areas, it's complicated. Here we can see that while access from the atrium is a little bit removed from this garden area at the back, right? It's hard to walk back there, and a public person visiting the house may not have physical access to that space, but they can see it, right? Through these colonnaded areas that are open towards this interior courtyard at the heart of the house, peristyle garden, rather, at the heart of the house. And then we have this rear peristyle, which is perhaps visible in the far distance, but not as clear, which would be more private, right? A more privileged area to access in the house than, for example, the atrium that you could walk in off the street into. So if we think a little bit about how to negotiate these axes of grand, humble, public, and private, physical access is one metric to think about, right? Can an average person visiting the house easily walk into this space? Would it be closed off to them? Would it be visible to them? So there's visual access versus physical access. And then what happens in the areas that your intimates, your friends and family might be invited into? Are those spaces equally highly decorated? We know of one here back between these two gardens that is the Alexander mosaic exedra. So very ostentatiously decorated area of the house, but one that might be reserved for people who are actually closer to the family. So one thing to think about when you're thinking on these axes is who gets to go into these different spatial areas. Once we have sort of mapped out using decoration and architecture, whether a space is accessible to the public, i.e. public, or inaccessible to the public, i.e. private, and grand, like our atrium with its decoration and its sort of scale, or humble, right? Like a smaller space that is perhaps undecorated, maybe a kitchen or a storage area, for example. Then we have to start thinking about how you map social relationships onto this spatial organization. So if we think a little bit about how these social relationships of a Roman household map onto space, I'm going to give you a quick introduction to some of the potential members of a Roman household. This is a really extended group. You have your sort of father of the household, the paterfamilias, the male head at the core, and then of course family members, familiares as well. That would be wife, children who are still part of the household, not either married off or starting their own households. And then you also have slaves, servi, who live in the household and are considered part of the extended household. And then sort of on the public side, you might have freed slaves, liberti, who would remain affiliated with the family by whom they had been enslaved, or to whom they had been enslaved before, and oftentimes might run family businesses or take sort of roles of extended commercial and personal relationships with their former masters. You also have friendly associates, amici, right? So these would be maybe the close friends and associates of the paterfamilias. And then there's another group called the clientes. And clientes, clients, in Roman times were sort of dependents. They were people who might support you politically in return for favors. They might come to you for things. And there was a morning ritual where your clients would come visit the paterfamilias, visit their patron at his in the atrium of his house, and either receive a small gift or make requests or just greet and sort of formalize these relationships on a daily basis in the morning. So that is part of the morning business of the Roman world, is inviting these people into the public section of your household. So then the question becomes, how does the social classification map onto the spatial classification of these axes, right? Who gets to go to the grand private spaces? Who gets to go to the humble private spaces? And as you can see here, Wallace-Haddrill has a nice diagram that sort of maps out how some of these classes fit in. So if you want to sort of understand the thinking of a patron who, as he decorates and organizes his household, one question to ask yourself might be, what does he show his clients? What does the patron of the house decide to decorate their public grand areas with versus their kitchens, the areas that would be most frequented by their slaves? And these ideas map onto more contemporary houses as well, and the way that we organize space throughout history, really. So you can see, as Wallace-Haddrill provided this diagram of an English sort of manor house, right? Where there are very clearly delineated areas for servants, like the kitchen and serving rooms, for sort of public entertainment, these grand halls, drawing rooms, dining rooms, spaces where elite guests would come. And then there's these private areas, right? Bedrooms, boudoirs, nursery areas for children, that would be yet again set aside out of sight of the public areas of the house and separated from the sort of operating quarters of the servant class. So as you're sort of thinking about your little houses that I had you put together so far, your typical American houses of today, I want you then to take the next step and to sort of start thinking about what are the definitional spaces of the house, what is necessary to make this house a house of this type, and where do those fall on these axes of grand, humble, public, private. If, for example, you were doing a Victorian mansion, a grand staircase might be a really important grand public element of the house, versus if you're doing a contemporary condo, maybe a guest bathroom is a public, humble space of the house. So try and think about how your contemporary spaces map onto these axes to get a better understanding of how we might think about and conceptualize space as both artistic and socially defined. And then the next question is to sort of think about what classes of people usually have access to these spaces. How does the social in your typical house plan of an American house today map onto the spatial? Just write it up in a few sentences or bullet points even is fine. I'm really looking forward to seeing the results of your work, and I will see you in the next lecture.